So today we continue our dive into our 6-week series based on the book Reckless Love, Jesus' Call to Love Our Neighbor. Last week, Jay kicked us off by introducing us to the main concept of the book, where Tom Berlin makes the case that Jesus teaches us how to love God with heart, soul, mind, and strength by showing us how to love our neighbor. He says that we usually think of it the other way around, that if we learn to love God enough, that love will overflow to our neighbors. And while there is certainly truth to that, Berlin offers us another way. He says that it is only when we commit to love our neighbors and intentionally accomplish this goal that we learn to fully love God. So in many ways, by working through the obstacles we encounter in loving our neighbor, we find the obstacles that keep us from fully loving God. Because if we don't love what God loves, then we don't fully love God. And we know that this isn't easy. That loving others can be difficult even in the best of times, but we have to remember that we are talking about one imperfect, sinful person attempting to love another imperfect and sinful person. And it isn't easy. And I also imagine that we don't make it easy for God to love us at times. But Jay reminded us that that is why it is important for us to begin with love and to make that our highest priority. Because without priorities, we can get caught up in the chaos and minutia of everyday life and fail to tend to what is really important. But when we are intentional about our priorities, we can live with confidence and purpose. And as followers of Jesus, his priorities should be ours. And Jesus was clear that there is no greater priority than to love God and to love our neighbor. So one thing that I've been doing a little more of in my 40s than I was in my 30s is going to the doctor. And I don't know if it's me or the doctors that I happen to find, but I'm finding that they don't really believe in me all that much. Many months ago, I went to a doctor to talk about some heartburn that I was experiencing. And he said that I may have some structural issues that are making me experience heartburn, but that it's likely also related to my diet. He said eating spicy food and drinking Diet Coke is making my heartburn way worse, but that from now on I should take this pill. I then asked him if I should stop eating spicy food and drinking Diet Coke, and he said that would be great, but that I'm probably not going to do it. I was a little offended. And I said, watch me. I lasted about 2 weeks. Soon after that, I went to a sleep specialist because I wasn't sleeping well. And he said, I probably have sleep apnea. He said, there are some lifestyle changes I can make, but likely will need some medical intervention to help me. I said, what are the lifestyle changes? And he said, well, he gave me a couple of things, and he said, it also might help if you took off a few pounds. I said, well, I'll just do that then. He said, no, you won't. So I said, watch me. And I did pretty well for a while, but eventually needed some additional help. More recently, I was talking to my physical therapist who was helping me with my sciatica. And I was told by another physical therapist of mine that if I fixed my posture, that would go a long way. So I told my current physical therapist that that's what my friend said, and he said that in theory, he was right, but that after years of somebody standing a certain way, it's really hard just to fix your posture. And it's not something that he thinks I can do long term. So I said, watch me. I'm in the middle of it, so we'll see how it goes. But I think that one thing that doctors know from experience is that unless the patient really focuses on getting better, it's not going to happen. And in general, people don't have the capacity to do this with everything else going on in their lives. They eventually spread themselves too thin, and if they don't prioritize it, something eventually falls off. Maybe you're one of those people that think you can do it all. But after a while, realize that you are stretched beyond your ability or time or energy. There are businesses and organizations that flounder when they try to stretch beyond their financial and personal resources. Life has taught us that resources are finite and must be managed selectively. We only have so much time in a day, so many resources, so much energy. But Jesus teaches us that love is not like that. That there is an infinite characteristic to love. One that is able to expand. And if you think about it, it plays out in our lives. For those of you with children or nieces or nephews, you know that when you have that second one, your love isn't divided, but exponentially multiplied. In the same way, we find God's love limitless and expansive. And I think we know this conceptually, but it's sometimes difficult to experience it for ourselves. In the passage we read last week and we talked about this morning a little bit more, we find Jesus telling us to love your neighbor as yourself. And the implicit message there is that in order for us to truly love our neighbors, we actually have to learn to love ourselves. But I think that's where a lot of us struggle. It's hard sometimes to love ourselves, let alone believe that God loves us. I don't know what the earliest memory you can recall, but for me, it was when I was 5. And I remember we were in India living there for about a year and a half. And I remember me and my brother, who was 2 at the time, playing with my uncles. Now, with my brother being so young and probably cuter at that age, he got a lot more attention than I did. And my uncles were playing with him and throwing him up and down. And I remember at that age getting jealous that they were not doing it to me. And in that moment, I remember hating my brother. And he was an obstacle to me getting the attention I needed. So I decided, forget this, I'm going to walk away. And I did that Charlie Brown walk. You remember that Charlie Brown walk? Put your head down, lean your shoulders over, just looking at the floor, not looking in front of you. And I must have been walking like this for a little bit, and before I knew it, I ran my head into a tree. Now, it hurt my head pretty bad, but not as much as it hurt my mind. Because you know the first thing I thought of when that happened? That was God punishing me for hating my brother. Can you imagine a 5-year-old walking around with that? Years later, I was talking to a friend who had a therapy background. And I shared that memory with her, and she said, well, that actually makes sense. We tend to hold on to a lot of those memories that produce in us a feeling of guilt or shame. And too often it affects us well into our adulthoods. And depending on the severity of those experiences, we can walk around thinking that we are not worthy of love. Thinking that we are too damaged for God to want to love us. But Jesus came to free us from that guilt and shame, to show us the expansiveness and transformative power of God's love, to show us that the only thing that is stopping us from accepting God's love is us. And that's important for us to do, not just for our own sakes, but also for the sake of the people in our lives. Because when we are that hard on ourselves, we tend to be that hard on others. When we beat ourselves up emotionally, we tend to do the same to others. When we don't experience God's love, grace, and forgiveness for ourselves, it's difficult for us to be channels of that to others. In our reading for today, we find Jesus reaching out to Levi, a tax collector. Now, as some of you know, tax collectors were one of the most hated groups in that time because they took your money on behalf of the Roman Empire, which used it in any way it deemed fit, with no concern for the people who were actually being taxed. And on top of that, the tax collectors were authorized to take additional money as a commission and just put it in their pockets. So to see Jesus associating with someone like that was a huge shock to the people, especially the Pharisees. So let's read this passage from Luke chapter 5 together. Afterward, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at a kiosk for collecting taxes. Jesus said to him, "Follow me." Levi got up, left everything behind, and followed him. Then Levi threw a great banquet for Jesus in his home. A large number of tax collectors and others sat down to eat with them. The Pharisees and their legal experts grumbled against his disciples. They said, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus answered, "Healthy people don't need a doctor, but sick people do. I didn't come to call righteous people, but sinners to change their hearts and lives." As Jay mentioned last week, the religious leaders of the time, including the Pharisees, lived strictly by all the laws and commandments of the time, which added up to about 613. But over time, they lost sight of the fact that these commandments were given to focus people on loving God and loving neighbor. Their focus instead became to ensure that they kept the commandments at all costs. So they had high standards for themselves. My guess is that they were pretty hard on themselves. They may have beaten themselves up a little bit if they failed in one or more of the commandments. But more importantly, because of that, they did a good job of being hard on the people around them. Quick to call out sinners and those who were viewed as outside of God's standards. Those who were outside of their circle, not to be associated with. But by including Levi, not just as an associate, but as one of his disciples, Jesus showed that there was no limit to his love. No person that was outside of it. I imagine that this didn't sit well with the other disciples either. They too would have looked at Levi as one of the worst of sinners. But Jesus stretched even them. As for the next few years, they ate together and they worked together. And together changed the world as we know it. And as some of you know, we now know Levi as Matthew, whose name is the title of the first book of the New Testament. You see, we tend to group and associate with people like us. Those who look like we do, those who have the same standards as we do, the same lifestyles as we do. But even secular research has shown that groups that are diverse do better. A study by the McKinsey Company showed that diversity in corporate leadership allowed those companies not only to outperform others, but the employees there were also happier and felt more purposeful. You see, they discovered something that Jesus emulated for us and calls us to in every aspect of our lives. He brought together people vastly different from each other. People who wouldn't share a meal together, let alone a handshake. People so diverse that it almost didn't make sense. But by bringing them together, not only did he work through them, but he also worked in them. So the challenge for us is to expand the circle, to expand the people who we offer our love to. Like the disciples, we may find that learning to love God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving our neighbors involves opening our circles up to who Jesus wants us to meet, who Jesus wants us to reach out to. And this can sometimes take us a little outside of our comfort zones. But transformation is rarely ever comfortable. But what we will find is that the more our circle expands, the more we will come to know the expansiveness of God's love for us as we learn what it truly means to love our neighbors as ourselves.